ES Audio.
From the Evening Standard in London, I'm John Weeks, and this is The Leader. Before we start, a quick warning. This episode does contain the stories of Grenfell survivors and some graphic details, which some listeners may find distressing. June the 14th. This year, the date marks the 6th anniversary of a London tragedy, the worst residential fire in the UK since the Second World War.
It's been a difficult time for a lot of us, and especially now when if you think about it, it's been 6 years, that's 72 months, that's a whole month for each life that was lost.
The Grenfell Tower fire, which has since led to a national conversation about cladding, building safety standards and culpability. But 6 years on, what is the legacy of such a tragic event?
As long as I have something to occupy me, I'm okay, but I just don't like being on my own, with my own thoughts.
These things do hit you and they never leave you. It's something that won't leave my life. I sometimes have difficulty coping with it.
Grenfell was the one story that I really couldn't shake because it was such a monumental tragedy.
I am still in the process of healing. This isn't something that happens from one day to the next. And even once, you do feel like things get better, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're completely healed.
To honour the anniversary this year, we hear the words of survivors, witnesses, and some of our own Evening Standard staff who were at the scene to report on the events, to tell the story and reveal the true legacy of a modern London tragedy.
I'm Tiago Alves, and I am a committee member at Grenfell United, and I'm also a survivor. I lived on the 13th floor. So I think the one important part to kind of build up to this is it was, a very normal June day. There was nothing particularly special about the day. My sister had her exam the next morning, and so she went to bed early, but we stayed up and had, coffee. We were enjoying our time together. I was completely oblivious to what was going on, still in my apartment, and then eventually I hear the door swing open. My dad is basically telling us to get dressed, to go downstairs. My sister was already obviously asleep, and we got our stuff ready. We put on some clothes and just went down the stairs. At this point, the fire still wasn't as big as what it eventually became. At the time, the corridors were still completely clear. There was no smoke anywhere. And then eventually we came downstairs and we went onto the green just by the tower, and we saw the fire develop from a fire within someone's apartment, come out the window and basically engulf the whole building in flames, which, obviously for all of us there was a complete shock, because from what a lot of bereaved survivors understood from the time, there was meant to be a stay put policy, and then seeing the fire just completely engulfing the building was just a complete shock to all of us, and obviously to a lot of the country as well.
Well, it's a night you'll never forget, although it's a night you'll always want to forget. I'm Jeremy Selwyn. I'm a photographer at the Evening Standard. I arrived shortly after 2 a.m. after being called by the night picture desk. It was obvious from the second I got there, and it wasn't fully ablaze at that stage, that this was a disaster about to unfold in front of my eyes. I immediately rang my picture editor and woke him up, Elliot Wagland, told him what was going on, and he immediately got up and went straight into the office. And so Elliot was in full awareness from very early on of what was going on that night. Unfortunately, it was a situation that got worse and worse. The fire became more vigorous and spread rapidly throughout the building. I managed to get to a safe position on a distance away from the building where I could take a picture from up high looking at the building, and the tower just became engulfed in front of my eyes, and I watched it burn, really, I suppose, and that night will never leave me.
I noticed blue lights outside, But I just thought it was someone stuck in the lift in the tower, because it happened that often. My name's Joe Delaney. I'm with the Justice for Grenfell group. It was about 5 to 1 or so. One of my neighbours knocked and said to me that the tower was on fire. So I went and had a look, and it was. And we were trying to throw stuff up at the windows to try and wake people and things like that, which I now regret, because I don't see the point in waking anyone up, to be honest. What did we wake them up for? We just woke them up for a bad death. You know, they might have had more peace had they been allowed to sleep, you know, and just carbon monoxide death instead of a, you know, terrifying, you know, towering inferno type one. It was 1:28 a.m. when I knew that people were going to die in that tower, because it was at that point I tried to ring 999 and declare a major incident. I didn't want to go downstairs and talk to the fire service people because I didn't want to get in the way. And yet it wasn't for a further hour until the fire service themselves declared it a major incident and decided that, yeah, they needed to get everyone out of that tower at that time. So, you know, I can't help but wonder what would have happened if I had been able to do that at the time. Would we have seen anyone die? One of my dogs, Luna, she basically jumped her lead that night, and then I was chasing after her. And as I ran around the block, I just saw 2 people like jump or get thrown or fall from the tower itself. And I just remember thinking it was just so, I know this is going to sound stupid, but the gravity was just so relentless. It was like you almost expected mercy to be shown, as that when one of them hit the side of the tower on the way down, it's like, that's enough. And it was like, no, he just kept falling. And it was at that point I was done. I was really done.
It was an extremely difficult situation to arrive into. The level of emotion on the ground was unbelievable. People's faces, the colour had drained from people's faces. They were walking around. It was almost like they were zombies. I'm John Dunne, crime reporter, London Evening Standard. Being confronted with that level of human misery is something that I hadn't come across before. I hadn't covered crime, etc., over many years and been on some very grim scenes. But this was something different. I mean, it's often overused, the term, it's like a war zone, but I can only describe it as like a war zone. The tragedy of it, the heat from the building, the stories of people jumping from windows, the smell of the smoke, people in tears, people clutching photographs of their loved ones, showing them to the media, saying, appealing for help to try and find missing people. The human misery was just on a scale I'd never come across. And at the same time, in a positive vein, everyone was trying to help each other to locate their loved ones, and everyone was positively trying to come to the aid of those who'd lost, some possessions or, in some cases, loved ones.
Let's take a break now. In part 2, have lessons been learned from Grenfell? And 6 years on, how the events around the fire are still impacting those who were there.
I've been diagnosed with complex PTSD as a result of this. I've almost been sectioned twice in the past 6 years, and I've never had mental health issues before this.
Six years on, government data shows 2/3 of London boroughs still have at least one tower block with the same combustible cladding blamed for fueling the spread of the Grenfell fire. On top of that, Natasha Elcock, the chair of Grenfell United, says 6 years since the fire, not a single person has been brought to justice.
I mean, if you look at how much effort has gone into, finding out who the Prime Minister was getting drunk with, or who he was having a party with over lockdown. If we'd have had even 1% of that effort focused on this matter, we would have seen prosecutions by now. But you see, there's no interest in it. And I can't help but think that it was because of the Prime Minister back then, Boris Johnson, because he was Mayor of London, of course, when the fire service cuts were pushed through. When he was questioned at the GLA during Mayor's question time about did he think that the cuts were going to have any form of risk for people's health, He just basically told the questioner to get stuffed. So that's what we're dealing with.
Such was the seriousness, such was the tragedy, and the ways poor innocent people lost their lives, lost their possessions. I think changes are being made, but there are still people. It took a long time, and it's still, people are still struggling, to get their lives back on track. They were given housing, but not in the same area, so all their, social and ties were cut. Schools, might have to be changed, etc. So, I think that the government has had to take this seriously. It's a politically incendiary issue, but I think there's more to be done, and there is, but reportedly still some, dangerous cladding on buildings, in the UK.
It does feel like we're still battling against a system that doesn't want us to succeed, and there has been so much political turmoil in the last few years, which makes it difficult to try and have a coherent plan as to what it is that we do as, bereaved survivors to change. We've had countless secretaries of state, we've had various housing ministers, and we've basically had a parliamentary system which is in complete turmoil, where 1 week we don't really know who we're meant to be speaking to. And so because of this, it becomes very tedious and very difficult to affect any kind of change, because at the end of the day, we need someone who is able to make a plan, create a plan, and see it through. But with these constant changes, it becomes very difficult, because we have to tell our story over and over and over and over and over again, in hopes that one of the secretaries of state or one of the housing ministers decides that our story is good enough that he wants to affect some sort of change. And that's whether that housing minister or secretary of state stays in power long enough to be able to do something about it. And because of this constant battling and this constant fighting to try and get ourselves heard, it becomes difficult, because we spend more of our time trying to explain why change needs to be effected, and instead of actually trying to come up with systems to better change the system to make sure something like this never happens again.
It was like I just stayed in as long as I had something to do type mode, I was okay. And I think that's how I've been over the past 6 years as well. As long as I have something to occupy me, I'm okay. But I just don't like being on my own with my own thoughts anymore, because they're not pleasant, if you put it that way. I've been diagnosed with complex PTSD as a result of this. I've almost been sectioned twice in the past 6 years, and I've never had mental health issues before this. And I think it's mainly just the injustice. I think that's what gets me the most.
Even some months after, being a crime reporter, I travelled around London. I think I was in the Grenfell area been down the A40 again for another story. And I could still smell the smoke, and whether that was a psychological thing or whether the smoke was still there, I think it was more a psychological thing. So it was a long time after. It really, of all the stories I've covered, it was definitely the most difficult to come to terms with.
I've had to process a lot of my emotions within therapy. I have been open in the past in other interviews I've done before about how I am still in the process of healing. This isn't something that happens from one day to the next. And even once, you do feel like things get better, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're completely healed.
My heart goes out to the survivors and the families, because they've got it harder than I've had. There's no way I say that it hurt me. It didn't hurt me as much as them, did it? So I don't look at the picture I took that night. It's a very, very rare thing for me to look at that picture. It's not something that I look back on and say, oh, what a great picture, a great news picture I took. It was a good news picture on the night because it told a story. But on a personal basis, it's something I never look at, never.
If you've been affected by any of the issues raised in this episode, then you can contact the mental health charity Mind on 0300 123 3393 or online through the link in our show notes. There's more news, interviews and analysis in the Evening Standard newspaper and at standard.co.uk. That's The Leader. Thanks for listening. We're back tomorrow afternoon at 4 o'clock.